Hello class, today's lecture we're going to cover chapter 2, which will give you an overview of sociological research. We're going to discuss the two major viewpoints within sociology, the 4 types of research that sociologists conduct, and also touch on some issues and ethical considerations when it comes to sociological research. So we're going to begin by taking a look at these two major viewpoints within sociology, either positivism or constructivism. So a positivist, as we reviewed a little bit last week, is more likely to conduct specific types of research. Particularly, the positivists are more interested in analyzing statistics and collecting data that can be boiled down to a more quantitative form. So you can boil it down to numbers and statistics and analyze social issues in that way. On the other hand, constructivists tend to utilize other research approaches that are more interested in looking at social structures and societies in a more in-depth way. So when we look at the 4 different types of research today, when we go over each one, we'll talk about whether it's more positivist or constructivist. And that should make more sense by the end of the lecture. So the scientific method, remember, is associated with positivism. Positivists were trying to, again, kind of introduce sociology as a social science, emphasis on the science. So they would utilize the scientific method, develop hypotheses, and test theories based on what we call empirical evidence. And again, that's the kind of evidence that can be measured, that comes from direct experience, scientifically gathered data, or experimentation. And that's distinct or different from personal or maybe biased opinions. So they felt by measuring social issues by way of empirical evidence that their findings would be more objective than someone who maybe just looks at a social problem and writes their opinion of it. So again, they're striving to be objective, critical, skeptical of anything that they can't see or measure, and logical. So if you remember from chapter 1, when we talked about Comte and Durkheim, we said that they were positivists. So we covered positivism a bit when we discussed these two sociologists. And again, positivists consider themselves to be those social scientists with the emphasis on the scientist. So positivists attempt to mirror the approach to research that other sciences utilize, like astronomy or chemistry or biology or physics. So they're trying to be as reputable as they can be alongside the other more established sciences. So as such, positivists prefer to only study things which can be objectively observed, measured, and analyzed in a numeric form. Think about like crime rates or divorce rates. So like those other sciences, positivists utilize the scientific method when they go about planning and conducting their research. The scientific method involves developing and testing theories about the world based on, again, empirical evidence. Empirical evidence, again, something that comes from direct experience, something that you've measured, or something you found out by way of an experiment. So they strive to only focus on empirical or objective data and evidence in order to ensure that there's no personal biases or opinions getting in the way of the conclusion. And again, positivists aim to draw conclusions that are generalizable. They try to make conclusions that any other researcher analyzing the same data would come to the same conclusion. So it can be generalizable. In other words, the research they conduct could be replicated across the country or across the world with the same or similar results. Now, if you think back to like your middle school or high school science classes, you'll remember the scientific method involves coming up with a hypothesis and then determining what the appropriate independent and dependent variables are going to be in order to test your hypothesis. So the next slide contains 4 different examples of different hypotheses, along with independent and dependent variables to kind of show you how positivists will go about their social research plans. So the first hypothesis we have up top here is the greater the availability of affordable housing, the lower the homeless rate. The independent variable is affordable housing, and the dependent variable is the homeless rate. So they're going to be studying different cities and the availability of affordable housing in different cities. And then once they have figured out that independent variable, they'll compare it with the homeless rate in those cities and see if the two are correlated and if their hypothesis is proven. Then the second hypothesis is the greater the police patrol presence, the safer the neighborhood. Your independent variable would be police patrol presence, and your dependent variable would be how safe the neighborhood is, maybe the crime rates in the neighborhood. Your third hypothesis is the greater availability of after-school programs, the higher the graduation rate. So your independent variable would be the extent to which after-school programs are offered, and your dependent variable would then be looking at the graduation rate and seeing if the two are correlated. So in other words, if there are more after-school programs, does the graduation rate in fact improve? And then our last example hypothesis is women earn lower salaries than men for the same occupation. Then you would look at gender as your independent variable, and salary for a particular position or occupation would be your dependent variable. So let's note what's at the bottom of this slide, and then we're going to kind of draw out what it means on the next slide. So when putting together a hypothesis, a social researcher needs to be very careful when defining terms. So how would you define a term like affordable housing or a term like safer neighborhood from the chart above? These definitions are not self-evident. You have to define what affordable housing means. So it's important to clearly lay out the, quote, operational definition of your terms before going about the research process. So positivists are aiming to perform, again, objective science using empirical or measurable evidence. But if you think about some of those terms on the last slide for independent and dependent variables, those terms may not seem too, quote, objective. Take affordable housing, for example. What is affordable for one person may not be affordable for another. So it's crucial that social scientists are very careful to define their terms and explain what they mean by affordable housing. For example, the researcher may say that affordable housing means that a person makes $150, that the affordable housing costs $150 a week. Then they would compare different cities or towns that offer or do not offer housing that costs $150 a week, and then look to determine and see if the homeless rate falls in line with more availability of, quote, affordable housing as they've defined that term. So returning to this importance of defining terms, you can also take a look at, from the last slide, the dependent variable of the homeless rate. How does the researcher determine what the most accurate homeless rate is in a city or in the country? Many homeless individuals have fallen through the cracks, and it's notoriously difficult to measure homeless rates. Most large-scale social surveys are conducted via phone call or via the internet, but most homeless people do not have access to a phone or the internet, so they are not being counted in those surveys. So many sociologists depend on the number of people who stay at homeless shelters within a given year to determine a city's homeless rate, but not all homeless individuals choose to stay the night in a homeless shelter. So it's still not the best, most accurate count. Other sociologists choose to go out and live and walk the streets and parks and go under bridges and talk to people and try to figure out what a city's homeless rate is by trying to come into physical contact with as many homeless people as they can. So regardless of how a researcher chooses to measure and define quote-unquote homeless rates, it's crucial that they maintain that definition across all of the different locations, cities, and towns from which they're compiling data. And hopefully this little elaboration and these examples make it clear how important it is for social scientists to define their terms and be very clear about their variables, operational definitions, and maintain consistency throughout the research process. So we've just gone over that positivist line of thinking when it comes to sociological research, and now we're going to turn to the other point of view, the constructivist or interpretive perspective. In Chapter 1, this was also referred to as the anti-positivist perspective. So the constructivist approach to research does not follow that positivist line of thinking of hypothesis testing model that we just went over. Like the name suggests, constructivists prefer to construct their conclusions or findings throughout the research process, not beforehand. So they don't try to make educated guesses or lay out hypotheses that they want to test. A constructivist aims to understand social worlds instead from the perspectives of the people on the ground, the actual participants of that social world. And they believe that this way of conducting social research yields much more rich or in-depth knowledge. So constructivists, as a result, don't really focus too much on empirical evidence like raw data and statistics. Instead, a constructivist's findings are more descriptive or narrative, and they aim to unveil the points of view of research subjects. Constructivism relies on the interpretations made by both the people living in the society and by the researcher. As such, scientific objectivity is not their goal. So now we're going to turn to a review of the 4 most widely used research methods for social investigation. Research methods refers to the way that sociologists plan to collect data for their research. As we will see, Two of these methods is most often used by positivists, and that's the survey and the experiment. And the other two methods are most often used by constructivists, and that's field research and secondary data analysis. So let's start with surveys. Surveys collect data from subjects who respond to a series of questions about behaviors and opinions, often in the form of a questionnaire. Surveys are easy to distribute and make it easier to compile data on a large population of people. Surveys allow respondents a certain degree of anonymity to express personal matters, as usually their names are not collected. For instance, if someone asked a woman if she had ever experienced domestic abuse in a one-on-one interview, that woman might not be comfortable sharing that kind of personal information with a stranger. But if a person or woman was asked a similar question as part of an anonymous survey, she's probably more likely to answer truthfully about her experiences with domestic abuse. So one of the most widely used examples of a survey is the U.S. Census. Now, a survey targets a specific population, and many populations are too large to survey every single person. So researchers in that case will choose a representative random sample of the population to participate. To go a bit further on that, again, a survey is going to target a specific population of society, and that population consists of the people who are going to be the focus of the study. So many populations, again, are too large to survey, so a researcher chooses that random sample of the population. For example, if you have never heard about the Nielsen television ratings, they're a research company that has been measuring American TV audiences' viewing behavior since the 1950s. And they install boxes in specific American family homes in order to analyze the viewing habits and make larger conclusions about the viewing habits of all Americans more generally. Importantly, though, they don't have to install one of these monitoring boxes in every single American household to do that. Instead, as their website states, chosen randomly through proven and rigorous techniques, Nielsen's TV Families represents a cross-section of representative homes across the country and each local market. Being able to measure in a way that fairly represents all races, ages, ethnicities, and behaviors is crucial for the industry to transact and analyze with confidence. So after the researcher selects the population they want to study and determines how to select their random sample, the researcher will need to create and develop their survey. First, they have to determine what questions they want to ask the participants and how to record the responses. Questionnaires are the most common type of survey, and questionnaires tend to ask a lot of yes or no questions or questions that yield quantitative responses. For example, some questions you might see on a questionnaire would be, do you attend church? Yes, no, sometimes. What is your salary? Between 15 and 30,000, between 30,000 and 45, between 45 and 75, or 75,000 or higher, and you would circle one of those quantitative responses. Or how old are you? So these types of surveys are most useful for putting research into numerical form, finding averages and probabilities, and maintaining that appearance of scientific objectivity. With that being said, do you think surveys are more useful research tools for positivists or constructivists? If you said positivists, you are correct. Positivists are much more likely to use surveys for their research. Now, some topics need to go beyond the yes or no questions on the questionnaire. So some questionnaires will include questions that leave a short space for an answer. For example, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what was your college major? Or what type of music do you listen to? And the answers to those kinds of questions would be considered qualitative data, opposed to quantitative, because these kinds of answers are not going to be as easily organized or tabulated, and the answers will become a lot more subjective. Now, one common alternative to the yes or no or short answer questionnaire is an interview. And an interview is a one-on-one conversation between the researcher and the subject. Participants are more free to answer however they like, without being limited to those predetermined choices on the survey or the limited space provided in a questionnaire. So interviews are similar to the short answer questions on a questionnaire, but during an interview, a researcher can ask for clarification or more detail. They can spend time on a subtopic that arises during the conversation in order to reach a deeper understanding, or they can ask additional questions that arise during the conversation. Now we're going to turn to our second research method, which is field research. So simply stated, field research takes place when sociologists go out into the world. They go and meet subjects where they live, where they work, where they play. Researchers gather their primary data from the social group's natural environment without needing to perform an experiment in the lab or conduct a survey. This type of sociological research is usually utilized by constructivists. Instead of using the scientific method, field research is rooted in what we call the interpretive framework. And the purpose of this type of research is to observe specific behaviors in a particular social setting. So in field research, it's the sociologist, not the subject, that is put out of his or her element or comfort zone. The sociologist has to step into a new environment to observe. Now there's 3 different subtypes of field research that we're going to go over here: participant observation, ethnography, and case study. The first type of field research is called participant observation. This occurs when a researcher joins people and participates in a group's routine activities for the purpose of observing them within that social context. One great example of participant observation is illustrated by Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dimed, from 2001. Her research question was, how do people get by on minimum wage work? To answer her question, she didn't make any objective hypothesis to be tested. Instead, she went all around the country, applied and worked in several minimum wage job positions. As she worked in these minimum wage jobs, she also limited her personal spending and her living space to what she could afford just from her minimum wage paychecks. The answer to her research question slowly unveiled itself to Ehrenreich as she was illuminated by her own experiences and by way of relationships and conversations she had along the way with her minimum wage earning coworkers. Ehrenreich worked as a waitress, a domestic maid, as a nursing home assistant, and as a Walmart associate. She consistently struggled to pay the rent on her small trailer in a trailer park while working full-time for minimum wage pay. What she found throughout this process of participant observation was that many people she developed relationships with during her field research were not able to sustain themselves. Many lived in what she called a constant state of emergency, with inadequate housing or homelessness, lack of childcare, and no health insurance. And there's a brief video on the previous slide, and you can also access it on Blackboard under Chapter 2 that summarizes EHRENREIC'S field research and her participant observation at the bottom of this slide, of this previous slide. And it's a great little video. It's not very long, so please give it a watch so you can get a little better understanding of participant observation. The second type of field research is known as ethnography. And ethnography refers to an extended observation of the social perspective and cultural values of an entire social setting. So it involves the objective observation of an entire community. This contrasts with participant observation, which is very subjective and involves the researcher taking part in the social group that they're studying. With ethnography, the researcher does not try to join the social group. Instead, they kind of sit around the edges and observe the society. The focus here is to figure out how subjects view their own social setting and how they understand themselves in relationship to a community. So ethnographies often conduct a process of collecting what we call oral histories from members of the society they're studying. An oral history is basically a biography of the subject. It may take an ethnographer 2, 3, 5 years to compile an oral history. He or she may need to spend 1 to 2 hours a day with the research subject, listening to stories about their past experiences, trials and tribulations, wins and losses, etc., until a fuller picture of the person's life appears. And that fuller picture can also point to important gleanings about the larger society that that person lives in. So there's a link to a documentary below, and I'd like you all to watch the first 10 minutes of the documentary to give you a little better picture of what an ethnography looks like. You can also find a link to this video on Blackboard again under the Chapter 2 content link. So in this documentary, a famous journalist named Louis Theroux travels to Lagos, Nigeria, where he meets with and follows along with several warlords and soldiers and attempts to understand the social structure and organization of Lagos from the people's own perspective. He doesn't try to join their society, however, the way that Barbara Ehrenreich did. Instead, he simply observes their world kind of from the sidelines and from the back seats of the cars they're driving in. Then our third type of field research is called a case study. The case study involves an in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. The researcher might utilize documents or archives, conduct interviews, or engage in direct observation. The case study would study and analyze a single case of a foster child, or a criminal, or a cancer patient. And by analyzing that single case of the individual's experience and struggles with a particular social issue, the researcher will aim to shed light on larger social problems. A lot of documentaries take that case study approach these days. So for example, Amazon's Free Meek focuses on a case study of Meek Mill's experience with the U.S. criminal justice system, but aims to use his case as representative of larger patterns that occur in society. And similarly, that Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, focuses on the case study of Stephen Avery, a man who claims he was falsely accused of crimes he was arrested for. And he asserts his innocence and claims he was framed by the local police department. One crime that he was arrested for and served 18 years in prison, he was actually cleared and released from prison when DNA tests proved he was not the perpetrator. But then he was arrested again and claims that he was being framed again. So this case study tells the story of one man, but does suggest that corruption and false imprisonment are larger social issues to confront. Now, the major criticism of case studies should not be too hard to guess. Since a case study, by definition, focuses on just a single individual or event or situation, it's difficult to make generalizable claims or to verify that a pattern truly exists in society just by looking at one person's story. So in other words, it's difficult to make universal claims based on just one person's experience. And that's what particularly a positivist would criticize a case study for. And those are the three subtypes of field research. So you have participant observation, ethnography, and case study are all types of field research. Now we're going to come back and look at the third type of sociological research more broadly. So again, we had surveys, we had field research, and now we're going to look at experiments. So experiments are useful for investigating relationships between variables to test a hypothesis. Notice those sciencey words again, hypothesis and variables. So do you think a constructivist or a positivist would be more likely to perform experiments when conducting research? If you said positivist, you are correct. So in an experiment, sociologists will create artificial situations that allow them to manipulate variables. Then they bring in research subjects into their artificial social situations and observe and analyze people's responses to the situation they are placed in. If you've ever seen that popular TV show, I think it's called What Would You Do? They basically have actors go in and do something maybe egregious or something that would bring attention to them. And then they film that actor performing that act, and then the main kind of focus of the show is seeing what other people's reactions to that actor are. Do they ignore it? Do they confront the person, etc.? So that's an example of a sociological experiment. Now, one really famous sociological experiment is known as the MILGRAM experiment. So the MILGRAM experiment was conducted by the social psychologist Stanley Milgram between 1960 and 1963. His experiment was prompted by the persecution and genocide of Jewish people in Germany during the Holocaust. And he noticed that in Germany there were thousands of people who worked in lower levels of the Nazi organization. These people had families, they had people that they loved. If you looked at them apart from the atrocities that they took part in, they might seem like, quote, normal people, except for the fact that their day job required them to be complacent with the deliberate culling of an ethnic group and other minorities. So Milgram wanted to know why seemingly, quote, normal people would allow themselves to take part in these evil acts. Milgram's hypothesis was that many Germans committed evil acts due to the fact that they were, quote, just following orders from authority figures. They were able to convince themselves that they were really not to blame for the atrocities of the Holocaust because they were not in those positions of power. So to test his hypothesis, Milgram created the shock experiment. So in the experiment, there's 3 people. 2 of the people are accomplices of Milgram. They're in on the experiment. They know the purpose of it. They know what's happening. And Milgram is instructing them what to do. So there's 3 people. 2 of them actually are Milgram's assistants. And 1 person is the subject of the experiment. So one of Milgram's assistants sits in a chair hooked up to a fake electrical shock generator. Though the research subject believes the shock generator is real, everyone else in the experiment knows that it's fake. In the next room, the other assistant sits at a desk and asks the research subject, and asks the other accomplice in the next room a series of questions. This person acts as the authority figure, the one that's asking the questions. The research subject sits in the room with the questioner or authority figure and has a set of buttons in front of them which indicate the level of shock to be administered to the person in the next room. The authority figure instructs the research subject to shock the person in the next room every time they get a question wrong, while constantly increasing the voltage with each additional wrong question or wrong answer. The volts are fake and no one is really being harmed, but the research subject is unaware of that and believes that they really are inflicting pain on someone in the next room. And that assistant or actor in the next room repeatedly cries for help and screams to make that more believable for the research subject. So Milgram found that the majority of people were actually willing to continue shocking another human being simply because the authority figure continued to insist that they do so. Contradicting the predictions of every expert he talked to before he did this research, Milgram found that more than 70% of the research subjects administered what they thought might be fatal shocks to someone in the next room. So the link on the previous slide, and again, you can find it on Blackboard under Chapter 2. There's a video that shows some of the original footage of the Milgram experiment and also splices in some interview clips with Stanley Milgram. It's only about 6 minutes. I think seeing the experiment is a lot more effective than me narrating it for you, so I hope y'all will take the time and take a look at that footage there. Now the 4th type of research method that sociologists use is called secondary data analysis. This type of research is not a result of first-hand or primary or original research. Instead, a sociologist might study previously written works by historians, sociologists, or economists. Or they might carefully analyze newspapers, magazines, or public records, or other media from a particular historical time. In order to conduct this type of research, a sociologist will perform what is called a content analysis. And content analysis requires the sociologist to apply a systematic approach to record and value information that they find from that secondary data. The key here is that the sociologist usually interprets the materials they are studying in an entirely different way than the original author intended. So one major advantage of secondary data analysis is that it's non-reactive research. And that means that this kind of research doesn't necessarily involve any direct contact with research subjects, and in that way it's not going to alter or influence anyone's behavior. It's just the sociologist with some archives or media from a particular point in time in history, and they sit down and spend a lot of time going over it, rereading it, analyzing it, and usually coming up with some sort of conclusion that is different than what the original author intended. So let's look at some examples. So this slide contains a couple of examples to help illustrate what secondary data analysis looks like. The first link on top is a short video that looks at TV commercials from the 1950s and 60s and analyzes the gender stereotypes that are prevalent throughout the ads. So in the 1950s and 60s, there may not have been a major upheaval about the way that women or husbands and wives were depicted in advertisements. But now, in 2020, looking back at those advertisements and analyzing them in order to look at the different gender stereotypes that were prevalent in those advertisements, a sociologist could look at these ads now and approach them with a very different point of view than when they were made in the 50s and 60s. So there's a video here. Again, you can find both of the videos on this slide on Blackboard as well. And then the second link is a 5-minute video clip from a documentary that looks at a book by sociologist Stanley Cohen, who wrote Folk Devils and Moral Panics, the Creation of the Mods and Rockers in the 1970s. So he studied the phenomenon which occurred in English society in the 60s, and it received the name of the mods and the rockers. And you can think of that as like the preps versus the rocker kids. So Cohen does not accuse either the mods or the rockers for the conflict between them of being responsible for the moral panic in the country. So at the time, all the newspapers and the news stories every night were talking about the violence between the mods and the rockers, and kind of creating what he called a moral panic in the society, that the teenagers were on the loose and causing havoc. So instead of saying that the mods and the rockers were responsible for this, Stanley Cohen stated that it was the mass media which assisted greatly in developing the conflict between young people and the interpretation of this moral panic. So the peaceful life of English society of the 1960s was struck by the clashes between the mods and the rockers because of all this media attention it was getting. Both the mods and the rockers were frequently called gangs. So Cohen studied newspaper articles and news stories published about all these, quote, street fights and conflicts between these two groups. And he also interviewed and observed these social groups in their day-to-day lives. And what he found was that the reality on the ground and the fiction being crafted by the media concerning these two groups of people were very different. Sometimes the newspapers would completely make up a street fight and write about it, and the people who were there on the ground would say that nothing had actually happened. So those are two examples of secondary data analysis, where you can read things that have already been published and come to interpret them in a different way. So again, secondary data analysis, we're dealing a lot with interpretation. So remember, Constructivism is much more interested in kind of this interpretive method. So secondary data analysis is going to be performed by and large by constructivists, not positivists. So now we've covered those 4 main research methods: survey, field research, experiments, and secondary data analysis. But one risk that sociologists always have to keep in mind, especially those utilizing surveys, experiments, and field research, is what is known as the Hawthorne effect, or the observer effect. And the Hawthorne effect is important to think about because it can complicate social research. The Hawthorne effect describes what happens when people change their behavior because they know they're being watched as part of a study. When research subjects are aware that they're being observed and studied, a certain degree of artificiality may emerge. They may do or say certain things because they know someone is researching them. So in other words, the individuals might act differently than they otherwise would if no one was watching them. Now we'll briefly turn to some ethical concerns and about sociological research. So the MILGRAM experiment would never be allowed to take place today, that shock experiment. And that's because many social experiments like MILGRAM's, and we'll talk about a few more during the span of this course, have over time become less acceptable because the situations that subjects were placed into during those experiments may have had some sort of long-lasting psychological effect on the subject. The MILGRAM experiment took place before the American Sociological Association, also known as the ASA, organized and began to enforce a compilation of formal guidelines for conducting sociological research. So the ASA enforces what we call a code of ethics, and that's a set of rules for ensuring the integrity of the research, the integrity of the filing of the data, the investigation, making sure that you don't leave anything out that maybe doesn't fit with your hypothesis. So being completely open about your research and your findings, and also open about resolving any complaints of unethical conduct. So some of the more important guidelines that the ASA Code of Ethics lays out are, number 1, informed consent. So this did not happen during the MILGRAM experiment. Informed consent means informing subjects of the risks and responsibilities of a study before they agree to become a part of that study. Number 2, sociologists have to ensure the subject's safety. And if a subject is endangered, they need to protect them. They also need to protect their privacy. And if a subject is endangered, they must immediately stop their research. Sociologists should strive for value neutrality, which means trying to be impartial and withholding biases or judgments. Think about that. Sociological imagination reading was all about trying to promote this kind of value neutrality. And taking yourself out of your own point of view to try to see things from a different perspective, a different social group's perspective. And then sociologists have an obligation to release all of their findings without omitting or distorting any data. Sociologists should not, quote, fudge their data or leave anything out that they didn't necessarily want to find. So as you can already probably tell, even in week 2, sociology is a very broad discipline. Human beings are very diverse, and there are innumerable social groups and social phenomena that can be studied within this discipline of sociology. So I just wanted to share just a snapshot of the huge range of topics covered within sociology by listing out some of the more popular sociological journals. So you got youth and society, or sociology of education, social psychology, social problems, work and occupations, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, rural sociology, nature and culture, men and masculinities, crime and delinquency, sexualities, sociology of sport, nations and nationalism, social justice research, race and class, city and community, food, culture and society. Got marriage and the family, politics and society, health and social behavior, family issues, artificial societies and social simulation, body and society, criminology, deviant behavior, ethnic and racial studies, gender and society, armed forces and society, agriculture and human values, media, culture and society, language and society, research in social stratification and mobility, and sociology of religion. And that's just a small snapshot of all the different kinds of topics that sociology really encompasses. So that is the conclusion for today's lecture. We've talked about a little bit more in depth about those two major viewpoints within sociology, positivism versus constructivism. Talked about those 4 types of research that sociologists conduct: the survey, the experiment, field research, which includes participant observation, ethnography, and case study, and secondary data analysis. And then we went over a few issues and ethical considerations when it comes to sociological research. Particularly keep in mind that Hawthorne effect, because we'll see that on the Chapter 2 quiz. All right, I hope y'all have a great week. Please email me if you would like to ask any questions about the material or this week's assignments, or if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one meeting with me, either virtually or on campus. Please let me know. I am here to help you. I hope y'all have a great week and hope to talk to you soon.